Let's talk about the Bible verses that have been used to exclude and other LGBTQ people for decades, the so-called Clobber Passages. We're not going to twist scripture. We're going to look at context, culture, and what these verses actually say and what they don't say. I'm David. I'm an ex-missionary, an ordained elder, and a gay Christian. You can check out my whole story. I'll link it below. But we are going to look at these Clobber Passages, and I'm going to try to get through them all in 10 minutes. Eventually, we will break down each verse and or section in its own video and really dive into all the details, but this is just a high level overview of everything. So go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Let's get into it. First up, let's look at Genesis 19, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, this story is often framed as a focus on homosexuality, but today, most scholars, both in the conservative and progressive side, agree that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was not homosexuality, and here's why. The story emphasizes and in the Bible later references back to Sodom and Gomorrah to point out the gang rape, the xenophobia, and the violence that's taking place here. Jesus himself calls out the violence and inhospitality. Later in Ezekiel 16, we read that the sin of Sodom was pride, neglect of the poor, and arrogance. In verse 49, it says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen." Jesus himself in Matthew 10 calls out the sin of Sodom as inhospitality, not even mentioning sex. So your takeaway here should be that Sodom and Gomorrah is about domination and violence, not about sexuality. Next, in Leviticus 18 and 20, they're often used to refer to homosexuality as abomination. Well, what is seldom spoken about are the preceding verses that qualify the behaviors that are happening in these specific verses. Now, if you look at the Hebrew or you research anything about the cultural context of the time that these verses were written, you'll see that these verses refer to ritual impurity, and they're not talking about universal moral law. They're specifically calling out the practice of sacrificing to idols at temples and utilizing temple prostitutes as a part of their worship to these idols. And therefore, they're being called out for this whole sinful ritual. In fact, the same word here for abomination was used for people who eat shellfish or wear clothes that have more than one type of fabric woven together. And these uses of the word abomination were meant to distinguish the Israelites from the practices of the Canaanites around them. In fact, Jesus never even mentions this as law, and Paul says that Jesus came to fulfill the law. So your takeaway here should be that this isn't a universal law that is being applied for ever and ever. This was calling out a specific practice that was deemed spiritually impure. So your takeaway should be that this isn't a timeless moral law being decreed. This is pointing out ancient purity codes for the time and the culture in those days. Next, in Romans 1, we see Paul calling out those who abandon their natural ways for unnatural ways. This is another example where we've got to look at the preceding verses to get a full picture of what's going on and why Paul is addressing this in the first place. Again, we see the context is idolatry. These people are engaging in temple sex with prostitution and exploitation. Paul even calls them out for having turned away from God and turning towards all of this idolic practice. Later, we see Paul using the same phrase for unnatural as part of God's redemptive work when he talks about grafting the olive branches together, and this is a positive use of the word. Also have Paul warning us in the next chapter, Romans 2, those who judge have no excuse. So your takeaway should be that Paul is calling out people who have turned away from God, looking for excess and domination, not committed same-sex relationships. Next, in 1 Corinthians 6, we see the phrase men who have sex with men. Now, there's two different Greek terms that are used here. Now, the first one, malakoi, meaning soft, effeminate, or sometimes luxury, is most often used in other texts from the time as referring to fabric. Now, there are some examples of it being used towards a person, specifically in Rome, but it was more used as a gender norm and not for sexual identity. And then we have the word arsenokoitai, which isn't used before, and many think that Paul was creating this word to talk about exploitative sex and temple prostitution in a mild way for his audience. Actually, this word, arsenokoitai, wasn't translated to be homosexual until 1946. And there's actually a really interesting documentary about the process for how that word became homosexual in the Bible and what the original translators regretted about making that choice. You should check out the documentary for sure. Now, while some scholars disagree about how to translate arsenokoitai, most biblical scholars do agree that the type of relationships that are called out in the Bible, referring to like temple prostitution, exploitative sex, are not the same as we see in today's culture where we have covenantal or committed, loving same sex relationship. So, your takeaway here should be that this isn't about identity, it's about abuse and power and cultural norms. Next, we have 1 Timothy 1, where we see the word arsenokoitai once more, and it's used amongst slave traders and murderers. Most scholars believe that this points to exploitative and coercive sexual acts, not relationships. And if we look at all of Paul's work, where we remember that he is focused on justice, not sexual orientation. So your takeaway here should be that this is about predatory behavior and not love. And lastly, Jude 6 and 7 is also commonly considered a clobber passage because of the phrase strange flesh. But a little research into this and you will see that this is referring to relationships between angels and humans. Strange flesh could actually be better translated as different species. And here Jude is critiquing the crossing of boundaries between angels and men, not LGBTQ people. So your takeaway with Jude should be that it's pointing out angelic rebellion and violence, not LGBTQ relationships. Now, every one of these texts have been used to shame and exclude for decades, but when we read them in their original context, we get a very different picture. None of these verses speak about what we mean today as being LGBTQ. They don't address loving, committed relationships. If you've been told that God can't love you as you are, you've been lied to, and you're not alone. Please subscribe to go on this journey with me. I'll be sharing a lot more of what I've learned on my path, and I'd love for you to join. Thanks.